right, we'll get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for this event. We are so grateful to have such an amazing turnout of folks who are interested in learning more about these connections between abortion access and sexual violence prevention. So thank you all so much for taking the time. My name is Sam. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the Senior Campus Coordinator at the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. And I just want to share a little bit about the Alliance, because I noticed in our registration, we have a lot of folks from New York, a lot of folks from New York City, but we also have a lot of folks from out of state. And so we just want to let you know who we are and why we have any business having these conversations. So the mission of the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault is to prevent sexual violence and reduce the harm that it causes through public education, prevention programming, advocacy for survivors, and the pursuit of legal and policy changes. And with that in mind, we thought it would be really important to highlight one particular program because having conversations about abortion access are really important, especially with young folks. And so if we're going to have a conversation around abortion access, we often like to include conversations about comprehensive sex education for youth and teaching affirmative consent to youth, which I'm sure is going to be a theme that often comes up in a lot of the things that our wonderful panelists are going to share with us. So for that reason, we just like to highlight the relaunch of one of our amazing programs, Project DOT. Project DOT is a youth-developed, youth-driven sexual violence prevention program that engages young people from New York City's underserved communities, including BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ communities, and even DOT started new groups in Bronx this past week, with 33 young people, and often still growing. So we give a huge shout out to DOT because it recently relaunched, and we just wanted to make that shout out here because all of this work is interconnected. If you're interested in learning more about the Alliance and how you can support our work, you can go to our website, which you can see in the chat shortly. And then I'd also just like to take some time to thank all of our amazing panelists for volunteering their time today and throughout all of the emails and color-coded emails that I've sent out over the last month-ish. So thank you all to our panelists. We'll be saying that 100 billion times throughout this event. A huge shout out to my co-moderator, who you will meet shortly, Meredith, and also Anita Krasnicki and Scarlett Thompson for their behind the scenes work. In particular, Scarlett is our tech genius wizard today on Zoom. So we're very grateful for that. We'd also like to give a huge shout out to Accurate Communications, Inc. For providing ASL interpreters, Kimberly and Tracy, who are pinned on your screen. And so some housekeeping, just so we understand the logistics of how this next hour and a half is going to run. We have about an hour-ish worth of pre-prepared questions for our panelists, and that will be asking them for an hour-ish. And then the last 20 to 30 minutes, we'll open up the floor for audience questions. Now, you can ask questions at any time throughout this event. We encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in there throughout the event or when we open up questions for the audience. Our chat function is also open. We ask that you don't put your questions there. The chats function is for folks to share comments, to share information, where we will be sharing information with you. And if you want to put some affirmations for all of the amazing things our panelists are about to say, please put in some of those affirmations because this fight is hard and we all need some positive words. So that's the function of the chat for now. We have our ASL interpreters, like I had mentioned, who should be pinned on your screen. We are recording this event and technology permitting, hoping that we are able to provide this recording to all registrants and it will have closed captionings. That recording will have closed captionings. And the last bit of housekeeping, I'm almost done talking and I'm almost ready to pass it to my co-moderator, but we will have a feedback survey at the end of this event where folks can share any feedback they have about this event, about the Alliance, about any of our panelists, positive, negative, critical, whatever, please fill out that survey and we'll make another announcement at the end of this. So I'm done talking, giving us those logistics, and I'm going to pass it to Meredith to introduce our panelists.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. So hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Meredith Wilson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a rising senior at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also the Alliance's campus intern for this summer, and I'll be co-moderating alongside my colleague, Sam. I now have the honor of introducing you to our incredible panelists. First, we have Kirby Tyrell, an attorney and lecturer in law. Next, we have Tracia Banuelos-Rovaris, the board vice president of the Abortion Conversations Project. We also have Carrol, a sexual assault nurse examiner, and Lindsey Curtis, a sexual violence preventionist educator. Unfortunately, Amy Smith had an emergency and won't be able to join us this evening, but we're grateful to have such a broad expertise represented here on this panel. And for more detailed bios of our panelists, please click on the link in the chat, which Scarlett will be dropping in there now. So with that, welcome to our panelists. Thank you for being here, and I'll pass it back to Sam to start with our questions.
Thanks so much, Scarlett. I hope that you click on that link in the chat because our panelists' bios are incredible. And I know that we're gonna hear their amazing expertise throughout this event. So let's get started. Let's dive in. We have a lot to talk about, y'all. So we wanted to first start by talking a little bit more explicitly about the connections and intersections between abortion access and the sexual violence prevention movement. So broadly speaking, we understand that there are these strong connections, but can you spell out some of these connections a bit more and share a little bit about how survivors are impacted by abortion access and really why this issue is important for survivors and victims of sexual violence? Any one of you are more than welcome to answer this question.
All right, I'll go ahead and kick us off because I'm hyped and ready in Aries. So I think one of the biggest connections is at the very ideological foundation level and also very literal. Think about survivorhood and what it means to be a survivor. And we're a community that's bound together at the core by our power being stolen from us at the hands of either someone or an institution, whether it's physical or psychological. Violence is defined by someone overriding your personal power. So I think to say that, the recent decisions and a lot of the anti-abortion rhetoric today kind of echoes the very same pain and power removal that survivors have experienced really is an understatement. Because both at the core of abortion access and for survivor justice is that we are trying to fight a capitalist colonial system for our bodily autonomy. We're rooted in our bodies, we live in our bodies, and a lot of these pains are happening to our bodies. So I'll pause there to let other folks, but I think that's one of the clear part is that this is rooted in bodily autonomy and an attack on bodily autonomy.
Thank you, Tracia, for that. This is about bodily autonomy. Do any other panelists want to talk about some of those connections?
Lindsey? Yeah, I'd like to chime in.
Go ahead.
By profession, I am a sexual assault nurse examiner, which is a branch of forensic nursing. And we care as forensic nurses for patients across the lifespan who have either been victims of or affected by violence. One thing we know when we see women immediately after a rape or a sexual assault is that their body has been touched in a certain way without their permission. My goal when I provide compassionate and trauma-informed care is to begin to re-empower that patient. So from the moment I walk in that room, I am doing things in a way to be able to restore power and control back to the patient. My main concern when Roe v. Wade was overturned was how this was going to both directly and indirectly affect my patients. We're there to provide acute care, so I may see a patient within hours or a few days following a sexual assault, but we all know statistically that maybe upwards of the most 20% of women ever tell anyone, never mind go see a physician or go seek healthcare. And so often, by the time they have to begin to make a decision if they should unfortunately become pregnant following a sexual assault, they're going to be past the time limit for a lot of the laws that are now going on in states. I recently had the pleasure to visit Wisconsin to do some training, and they are one of the states with the trigger law, and their trigger law dates back to 1849. That is just utterly ridiculous. I don't even know if women were even considered people or citizens back in 1849. but it's just, we need to think about, this is so far reaching. We know that limiting access to health provided and safe abortion is not going to limit women from getting abortions. It's just going to limit their access to safe abortions. We know that following sexual violence and sexual assault, there are a lot of negative outcomes that go along with that. And those outcomes are exacerbated or compounded when a pregnancy results from sexual violence. So this is far reaching, and it will directly affect the practice of forensic nurses across the country.
I'll jump in here as well. I second everything that Tracia and Karen said. It does really boil down to that essential question of bodily autonomy and freedom of people to make decisions about their own bodies, which we know is so important when we're educating young people about consent. And there's so much to discuss when it comes to prevention of sexual violence and having conversations about bodily autonomy and consent. It seems to me that the message we are receiving by the overturning of Roe v. Wade is that the mere ability to become pregnant is consent to be pregnant. And what is the implication of that for young people when they're hearing these messages that the mere ability to become pregnant is consent? When we're trying so hard in this movement to roll back ideas about who makes decisions in sexual encounters, who has the right to someone else's body, right? When we are trying to undo a lot of these terrible lessons that social norms have taught women especially. And I wanted to highlight some statistics here because when we talk about sexual violence, it can kind of become so narrow, but also there's sexual violence that occurs within the context of intimate partner violence relationships. And this will certainly threaten the safety of people who can become pregnant who are involved in these harmful relationships. Some statistics state that half of survivors who are experiencing an intimate partner violence relationship include sexual violence as a form of harm they're experiencing, and 17% are experiencing reproductive coercion. So when we talk about responding to sexual assault survivors who may be navigating these intensely difficult situations, which we know can become deadly, I'm thinking of them as well navigating not just post-sexual assault care, but also navigating exiting an abusive relationship or keeping themselves safe in an abusive relationship.
I can also just briefly jump in. So one thing I just wanted to add to all of the really great thoughts that have been shared is when I think about these movements, something that I find really helpful is to just bring in the reproductive justice framework. And so for folks who aren't familiar with that, reproductive justice is a term, a movement that was coined in the early 1990s by a group of Black women. And it kind of thinks beyond our conceptions of just reproductive rights. It thinks beyond Roe, which is even more important in this moment. And it recognizes that people should be able to make decisions about their bodies, to have children, to not have children. And then beyond that, to raise their children and to live in safe and healthy communities, to be safe from violence. And so I think there are just so many ties between these movements of this ability to feel safe in your community, to feel like you have the resources you need to succeed. And so I think when I think about approaching all of these issues, that framework is just such a useful guide because it allows us to think beyond the specific issue and really think about what individuals need to feel safe and to feel, I don't know, like to not be at risk of violence or at risk of having their rights taken away. So it's really about kind of a human rights framework. So I'll just add that in. And I'll probably be talking a lot more about that because I think moving forward, it's just like really essential if we're thinking about where we are in repro at this time.
Thank you, everyone, for that amazing insight and just really deep dive into the large conversation we're having this evening. So another piece of kind of connecting abortion access to the sexual violence prevention movement, we often see in legislation or legislators are stating that there will be exceptions to the restrictions of abortion if a pregnancy was caused through rape or incest. And so the question here is general for any of you. What are your thoughts about these exemptions? What comes up for you with these exemptions? Because this is often the ways in which folks who may not be as connected to the movement connect these two quote unquote social justice movements, abortion access, sexual violence prevention. So what are some things that come up for you with these exemptions?
I can start this conversation. When I hear that there will be exemptions for cases of rape or incest. I am highly skeptical. And I do believe that maybe people who are shaping these laws aren't really familiar with the way that sexual violence works. But as we know, it is one of the most underreported crimes. I think that this will serve to further marginalize survivors and to put them on trial, to question survivors, and to make survivors invisible. I think about the story that recently broke in the news about a 10-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted and became pregnant in Ohio and crossed state lines into Indiana to receive abortion care. Now, this story was tweeted out. It was picked up by national headlines. The president included this in a speech, and there was a wave of articles saying that this isn't true, this can't be happening. I believe the Wall Street Journal titled one of the articles, "A Rape Too Good to Confirm." And I think that we should really digest that as just, first of all, it's horrible, but also the fact is that people view sexual violence under very strict terms, right? There's a perpetrator hiding in the bush, they leap out, they attack somebody, and then survivors act a certain way. Survivors go to the police, survivors will do this. And all the progress we have made during the Me Too movement, during a time we really opened discussions about what different kinds of sexual violence can look like outside of the public narrative that is really often enforced. I just see this further marginalize people, stigmatizing survivors, putting them on trial for their experience. So it's very saddening.
That's a gross headline. Absolutely gross. Tracia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I also agree with everything Lindsey's saying, and also just want to add, we also, again, survivors are constantly not believed. So there's no, to act as if that would go away when someone is naming childhood sexual abuse or incest in the home or family just adds another layer of stress as well. Quite often to even utilize like these legal resources, survivors have to some way rely on the criminal justice system to prove, have a police report or something done to kind of demonstrate that they were actually assaulted, which is also just so problematic because violence doesn't only take specific forms. But I also want to mention, highlight how trap laws exist. There is a resource on the Guttmacher Institute's website about trap laws, which are targeted regulation of abortion providers. And so even if you live in a state or an area that allows you or gives you this, legal permission to access an abortion, it doesn't guarantee, one, that there's even going to be a local resource, not 100 miles away that will perform the abortion, or someone will actually, a physician will prescribe you the pill. So you can get it, but if the access isn't there, that's also difficult. There's also no tangible preventative measure to prove that survivors wouldn't further be victim blamed or slut shamed or even told to keep their assaulter's child. There are many news articles about various congressional members and lawmakers who have said very unhinged and latent white supremacist thoughts that survivors should be thankful to keep an assaulter's child, or why do you have to further enact harm because the harm was enacted to you? And so there's tons of spaces where people say they're unhinged, anti-choice beliefs all of the time. So just having this type of law, like you mentioned, maybe on paper, it sounds good to someone, but in practice, it's just even more difficult and puts another level of hoops for survivors to jump through.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that there is a very significant healthcare backlash to all these comments, everything that's getting out in the public, and to the Supreme Court's decision. I do travel around the country doing what are called clinical skills labs, where we're teaching new sexual assault nurse examiners how to perform exams on patients, and they get to practice their skills. And I'm hearing from nurses in different states where there are situations where people walk into a pharmacy and they want to purchase condoms. And now the pharmacist has the condoms behind the counter and is going to lecture that person who was asking for condoms based on their own personal and or religious and or political beliefs. We have doctors in some hospitals who are scared to death to even prescribe emergency contraception to a patient following a sexual assault because they're afraid of the backlash of the laws. Are they now breaking the law? Are they going to be in trouble? So there are so many misconceptions and misinterpretations about what's already out there. I'm really nervous about where it's going to go. And as far as these laws that talk about the eligibility for termination of pregnancy following a sexual assault if it is determined the pregnancy is based on incest and or any other reasons. Often by the time that determination has even been made or proven, because it's never accepted right off the bat as fact, the woman may be past a good, healthy time frame to terminate a pregnancy. We have in this country the need to put people in boxes, and reproductive health freedom and the right to terminate a pregnancy resulting from rape should be available to all women, regardless of who the person was that raped them.
So I can also just talk legally, I guess, about how these show up. So I would say in the past few decades, politicians have inserted these exceptions because it allowed them to pretend that they were concerned about the patient. How in practice, I would say they are very rarely used. They require patients to usually make some kind of report to law enforcement. We all know there are very valid reasons why many patients do not want to make those kinds of reports. And so a very small percentage of patients, all patients, including patients who have experienced sexual assault, are fitting into these exceptions. So I think we are already seeing that these kinds of exceptions are going away because now politicians are emboldened and they don't have to pretend they care about the patient anymore. So I think you'll notice in a lot of the recent trigger laws and a lot of the other laws that are coming out now, I think we're not going to see those exceptions anymore because they don't have to pretend that they care. The only other thing that I would just say about this is that I think another problem that these exceptions create is that they can create stigma around abortion. You know, anyone should have a human right to abortion. No one should have to prove that they deserve an abortion. Anyone's reason for having an abortion is valid. Obviously, experiencing a sexual assault, rape, or incest is horrifying, but there are so many reasons why people decide that they need to have an abortion. And I think when we create these categories of some people are more deserving than others, or some person's reason is more valid than others, I think that just creates so much. Abortion is already so stigmatized in our country. I think it just really contributes to that, which is just so harmful to all people.
Thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts about that. I'm going to pass it over to Meredith to really talk more about these connections between identity, intersectionality, and abortion access. So Meredith, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. So for our next question, in connection with some of these previous responses, would anyone like to expand on why abortion access is an issue of racial and economic justice, among other forms of justice?
I can start. So I really, really love this question because I think, again, like everything is, like all oppression is interconnected, while all liberation attempts have to be interconnected as well. And this country, like this country that was stolen and founded, was founded on the belief that Black, Indigenous, people of color, like that we don't have the right to bodily autonomy. That's what slavery is, a bodily autonomy issue at the core. And it's not just a belief that we don't own our bodies either, but that those who are white and or wealthy also own our bodies as currency. Like our current exploitation is the basis of a capitalist economy every day. The fact that we're all burnt out after a couple of hours of work or we're working through a pandemic, but I digress. But also so much of this, so much of these fights, again, are rooted against this country is founded on the sexual violence and sexual exploitation of Black people, forced birth of Black children into slavery, and even white supremacist attempts to breed out Black people or to bring out individuals that were not desirable. And so at the core of, anti-abortion work is also like a very strong vein of white supremacy that also only wants to preserve white lives very openly and very intentionally. And so really, again, at the core of the folks who are also spewing anti-abortion rhetoric, they're also spewing racist thoughts, anti-disability thoughts, and they're also very openly against very specific groups of people from existing today.
I kind of smiled when you first asked that question, Meredith, because I am older pretty much than everyone else on this panel. I know I am. I was around when Roe v. Wade was passed. I was a senior in high school. I graduated from nursing school in 1975. I can remember vividly working in the hospital and white women, middle class women coming into the hospital on regular basis for what we used to call a DNC. And that stands for dilation and curettage. And that was the scraping out of the uterus. And charts were documented in such a way to justify these procedures. And we all knew what they were coming into the hospital for. But yet women of color, we couldn't go into the hospital to have those types of procedures. Whether insurance was covering it or not, we just didn't have those options. And so those of us of my age, we know of either family, friends, or young girls in the neighborhood. And you may have all heard the horror stories about coat hangers and crochet hooks. They're not stories, it's truth. We lived through it. And it's just amazing because I never thought that I would live to see or live to be in a society where my granddaughter, who is 19 and in her second year of college, has less reproductive freedom than I did at her age. It's really sad. I mean, I'm hopeful. I really am hopeful, but it's just sad that we're in this situation today. So the horror stories that you heard from the past, they are not stories, they are real. They happened. I can attest to it.
I can jump in and just say, I think reproductive justice is so clearly a racial justice issue. I think if we think about who is going to be most impacted by abortion bans and abortion restrictions, we just know that it's going to be people of color, low-income people, people who live in rural areas that don't have access. And that's just a reality, like all of the stats back that up. And so I also think it's very important to think about, what does not having access to abortion mean? It means forced birth. And it means making someone undergo pregnancy. And we also just know that the maternal mortality, I always struggle with that. Maternal mortality rates for women of color are 3 to 4 times higher than for white women. And so not only are we forcing people to give birth, but we're forcing people to give birth in situations that are not safe and are going to cause harm to them when we know abortion is incredibly safe. And just, I think it's just impossible to separate these two things when we know who is going to be most impacted and most harmed by the laws that are being passed and that are going into effect now.
I just wanted to add a little bit more to this conversation, in that abortion will continue, whether it is legal or not. And although we're talking a lot about access and who will be able to have that access, but also the other side of that is who will be criminalized and who will become at the mercy of the state for either assisting, providing, or being aware of, or having abortions, or even having miscarriages. Who will be criminalized for that? Who will face penalties and incarceration based on that? And that will be along racial and economic lines. And I also wanted to bring some other people into the conversation, considering that we're seeing a big pushback on many other kinds of bodily autonomy rights, including the rights of trans youth to access healthcare. These things are all kind of together and happening at once. So it's good to take a big picture look to say the loss of this right and this loss of this right are kind of coinciding. And what I suspect will be the loss of more bodily autonomy rights, as well as people who experience disability. People who have disability and the ability to make decisions about their own bodies, including a history in this country of forced sterilization of both Black and brown women, and also trans people, queer people, as well as people who have disability. So the reproductive, there's the other side of it, which is a loss of other types of bodily autonomy to be considered.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing this. I think these are some really tragic realities, and I appreciate you explaining them to us a little bit more. So for any of our panelists, in thinking about the pursuit of justice, what are some suggestions you have to be able to directly support folks from historically exploited communities who might be seeking abortion? So anything from mutual aid funds to nonprofit to support to legal infrastructure, anything of that nature.
I'm happy to start with this one. I think, so I think it's been really wonderful in the reproductive rights community. It's been really wonderful to see the outpouring of people wanting to help. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's really important to make sure that we are learning and being led by the people who have been doing this work for decades and have built incredible infrastructure. So there are wonderful reproductive justice organizations around the country. Almost every state has an abortion fund, which has been doing this work of funding people's abortions, coordinating logistics, coordinating travel, helping folks with all of the logistics that go into getting care. And so I think there's been a lot of kind of helping with camping or all of these kind of like auntie networks. And I think people just need to be really thoughtful about what your limits are and how you can learn from the people who have the most experience in this work. It's obviously wonderful to want to help, but to think about, you know, is a random person coming to you from the South going to want to live in your house? They don't know you. They don't know if you're safe. They don't know if they can trust you. They don't know, you know, anything about you. So I think really relying on the people who have built that trust and have kind of established those relationships is so crucial. So abortionfunds.org is always a great resource, but I'm sure folks have other thoughts too.
I think from a personal level, I would implore young people and older people alike to get involved politically. And I mean, even in the very basic stages, your city council persons, your representatives into your state government, get involved, find out what their views are, and then hold them accountable. And those who are in office who are not doing what you elected them to do, vote them out of office. We can no longer afford to just be apathetic or just to sort of go with the flow. We have got to mobilize, and we have got to make sure that people get out and vote, and that we're putting people in office who deserve to be in office. That's a very basic way to do it. I implore you to talk to your daughters, your sons, your cousins, your neighbors. And these are not issues that need to be hidden. We need to talk about them up front. There are fraternities, there are sororities, there are church groups, there are all different organizations that we belong to socially that we need to begin to have them more active, because one by one, our own rights and autonomy are going to be eroded. This is just the very beginning of what I fear is to come down the road. I mean, we've already heard from one Supreme Court justice who began to already mention how other rights and other laws need to now be looked at, referring to what was or was not indicated in the Constitution. And so this is just the beginning. So you have to get involved. And, you know, I know a lot of people personally who don't vote, and it drives me crazy, because the power of getting out there and voicing your opinion, coloring in that little circle or pulling down that lever or whatever, it starts basically on the local level, and then it just moves upward.
I think something I want to add to the conversation is also, I think, a larger point of critique, and I think feedback for any of us who work in advocacy or for rights, and that the radical honesty that like this mainstream pro-choice movement has not always been safe nor validating for people of color, and especially for people of color that are non-binary or gender non-conforming or trans. We think about a lot of how the whitewashing, but also some of the eugenic origins of certain reproductive justice. You know, you look at Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood has owned that. You know, their founder, Margaret Sanger, was an avid proponent of eugenics and spoke at Ku Klux Klan rallies, and they've named it and they've put it on their website and have mentioned how they tried to disown this. But also, there are still resources today that highlight the far amount of racism that people of color also experience working at organizations today. Repro Jobs on Instagram and Twitter have done a lot of really great work highlighting how even at these great, you know, reproductive rights groups that are the bastions of what we want for liberation, they're still also anti-Black and colorist and doing a lot of problematic pieces. So I think something that folks in reproductive rights can do is really own where this movement has exploited the labor of people of color, but then also has turned around and spat in our faces. I think it's also up to folks who work at clinics to hire counselors or staff that can speak to the various nuances of identity. I think, for example, you know, the way that Black Christianity has worked both for and against Black people is very nuanced. And I don't think it's up to, you know, a white provider advocate to try to talk about that, but it is your responsibility, if you have resources, to hire individuals that can support clients and patients that will be going through those experiences. So I think it's also making sure that we don't let ourselves off the hook because we aligned ourselves with reproductive justice when there's a lot of harm that's also been caused in this community.
Absolutely. Lindsey, do you want to add?
So many great things have already been said, but I just wanted to say, if we're looking beyond donating or beyond voting, I really love what Carrol had to say about turning to our communities and talking to each other. I think it's really valuable. And I think if you're like someone who maybe only has a little bit to donate and you're like, I don't really know what else to do, I would say find your niche and explore all the interconnected issues and find out where you can show up based on your skills, based on your experiences, whether that's working with queer youth, whether that's environmental justice, tribal sovereignty. So many of these things are interconnected. And when you arrive on the scene to see how you could be helpful, just ask, how can I help? And be ready to listen. Where do you want me to stand? You know, I think that we are going to go through so much. I've heard that a lot tonight, but we're going to need to become very interconnected and decide that all of these fights that are interconnected, I'm going to show up for that fight. So I'm going to show up for this battle. I'm going to show up for this person who may not have the same experiences as me, and say, I'm in this with you, and show up for each other. So.
Thank you all for speaking to these different facets of the movement. I see some of those resources populating the chat now, if anyone would like to check them out further, and I'll pass it back to Sam for our next questions.
Thanks so much, Meredith. And shout out to Shatisha for all the positive affirmations in the chat. It's great to know that you're here, but also, like Lindsey was saying, we all need to support one another. And even if it's a heart emoji in the chat, like, we're in it for the long haul, you know, and every little bit of support counts. So just much, much appreciated for all the folks in the chat. A question that we have about this intersectionality and abortion access, right, is we have been seeing a lot of language issues around gender inclusivity as it relates to abortion access. So in your thoughts and your experiences, how can we ensure that conversations surrounding abortion are inclusive of all identities, and it really account for the needs and experiences of trans and non-binary folks with the capacity for pregnancy? So generally speaking, what are some of your thoughts there? And then we can get a little bit more specific with action items and resources that might be helpful for folks in the audience. So anyone is welcome to come on in and join and share their thoughts.
I think one of the most fundamental and quickest and easiest ways that we can do is stop centering exclusively women in the conversation about abortion access. Just being very open and like trying to transition from women to people. Just to own and share the fact that there's a wide umbrella of identities that have to, you know, receive abortions. Something I'm really proud of, you know, on our board, Abortion Conversation Projects, because we have a couple of doctors, we have like a doctor who performs abortion, a couple of clinic staff. And so as a group, we just try to go through and update our website, our materials. We're sending materials across the country about combating stigma. And yet if we're only talking about folks in very narrow, specific ways, then we're ostracizing those people. And we're also telling them, one, we don't acknowledge your identity and we don't respect your identity. So it's about being very open and intentional with whatever way we're communicating with the public to make sure that we're being inclusive in our language and we're modeling it first, so that when people pick it up, we've set that model and that we are taking leadership in that.
One thing that I've found helpful, I think there is sometimes a resistance to referring to pregnant people or being more inclusive from folks who feel like that will make it no longer a women's rights issue, or, you know, somehow women will be erased in this conversation. And I think a framing that has really helped me is to think about the folks that passed these laws that want to restrict abortion. They are doing it because they are sexist. And so they are trying to restrict the rights of women. They are trying to, you know, exert power and control over women and their bodies. However, the impact is much broader than that. The impact is not just women, but also trans people, non-binary people. And so I think you can think both can be true at the same time. You can acknowledge that these laws are sexist and the intent behind them was to control women, but you can also acknowledge that the impact is much broader and that, you know, we don't need to feel like we're afraid of it no longer becoming a women's issue. It can be both. And that way we can actually welcome folks who have felt really marginalized in this conversation, which is so essential because they are having abortions too. And, you know, there is just an additional layer of harm that is being put onto them when we erase them.
I mean, everything everyone said, I totally agree with. working in healthcare, I can just tell you that we have such a long way to go. Oh my gosh. I mean, the disparity in healthcare provided to people of color, I mean, is well known. I mean, Oprah just had a documentary on it, so we all know it exists. The statistics around deaths from COVID alone point out the disparity. So I invite those of us who are in healthcare or are thinking of going into healthcare to keep all of these things in mind. And I can say specifically to those forensic nurses out there who are practicing and listening and are living like me, because I now live in the state of Oklahoma. So those of us who are living in states that are very restrictive and or states that are fighting against some of the restrictive laws and some of the trigger laws, know that you're not alone. So if you're in healthcare, look to your organizations. I happen to work for, and I'm also a member of the International Association of Forensic Nurses. And we put out a position paper back in December of last year about reproductive rights. And while I am not speaking directly for my organization, I can tell you that I agree with every aspect of their position paper. And if you'll bear with me, I just like to read them really quickly because I don't want to misquote them. But they just have 7 things that I believe in. And this is that reproductive health is a basic human right and one of the most important aspects of patients' lives. Individuals have the right to make informed healthcare decisions, including exercising their reproductive healthcare options. All forensic nursing programs should offer and, where requested, provide emergency contraception to their patients. Individuals who experience pregnancy, whether from sexual violence or any other circumstance, have a right to exercise all reproductive healthcare options, including abortion. Policies or laws that make contraception and abortion care inaccessible to all or some people are engaging in reproductive coercion on a structural level. Denying reproductive rights to patients, including access to safe and legal abortion, is in itself a form of control and abuse and will result in serious negative consequences, including immediate and long-term injury to reproductive organs, infertility, and even death. And reproductive health research needs to be more gender inclusive in order to more fully inform the needs of transgender and gender diverse patients. And so I invite those of you in healthcare to look to your organizations for some position statements, get involved in public policy, because unfortunately right now, the people who are making laws, they just don't have a clue most of the time. And it's so much easier to construct a law that meets the needs of the people than to try to undo a law once it's already on the books.
So much has already been said. That's really wonderful. I just wanted to jump in and say that I think it would do us a lot of good to embrace each other and our different struggles and how those struggles are so similar, and to listen to trans people when they are describing their struggles. As a cis woman, I do know that there's so much work to be done. If you ever talked to an older generation person, it's just like there's a lot of emotion there about women's rights issues and women's rights, but we need to give more space to trans people to be leaders in the movement, not just to say, we're going to include you in this conversation, or I'm going to say people instead of women. I think it really needs to be action oriented and to have trans people front and center and to embrace our mutual struggles and to not play on oppressive frameworks turf. That really kind of angers me that we are constantly forced to reduce ourselves in these conversations and to use their language. And for the cis people to go back and go talk to that older generation and do the work there that needs to be done, to say these systems of oppression affect us and other people the same, and we need to be really collaborating. Now is not the time to feel like this is just my struggle. So yeah.
I really love everything that everyone said, and I like the pull quote of "this is not just our struggle," right? And so we want this panel to be, and it already is, a very action-oriented panel. And so with that thought in mind, because we can talk about all of these topics, right? But like, where is the action behind these things? I can't tell you how many webinars I've been to where it's just folks talking at me about their thought experiments with oppression. And I'm like, okay, then what do I do when I leave? And so in this kind of vein of action-oriented thinking, do any of you have any suggestions for resources for trans and non-binary folks seeking abortion services or reproductive health care? And then a kind of follow-up to that is, do you have any suggestions for resources or things that might have helped you as the cis folks who might be on this panel, where cis folks can learn more about how to accurately conceptualize abortion according to its gender inclusive realities? So just any resources that folks can think of on either end of those areas of education and access would be helpful. So anyone is more than welcome to jump in.
I can answer the first part quickly. I think, because I can put up my clients for the last 4 years, and they often offer trans care, which is incredible. And, you know, besides abortion care, that's often a huge part of their practice. And I know that they, you know, I can't speak for all of them, but they are really working to make sure that they are providing gender affirming care. So I think for folks looking for abortion services, independent abortion clinics are a wonderful resource. And that, sorry, to clarify, that just means a non-Planned Parenthood clinic.
Well, I'd like to put in a plug for the New York City Alliance. And the reason I want to put in a plug for the Alliance is, and thank goodness they're back, because we really missed them when they weren't here. Those of you who live in the state of New York, especially in the Downtown area, but anywhere in the state of New York, they are an amazing resource for what's going on in individual communities. A lot of us in healthcare, especially in acute care settings, tend to function and know everything about what goes on in that building, but we need to know outside in the community so that when we're seeing these patients, we're referring them. I firmly believe that if we can say to them, listen, you go down to this street, it's a red brick building on the corner. When you walk in the door, there's a desk on the left. Go over to that desk and Debbie behind the desk will help you. When we've gone to these facilities, when we visited these facilities, when we know exactly where we're referring our patients to, that's going to make such a difference. And I'm from one of those older generations. And as you know, I didn't give my pronouns when I first introduced myself, and I should have. So it's an ongoing learning experience for me. And so I invite everyone from my generation and older, reach out to the younger generation. They will help you. But you can't lie and rely on the fact that you are from the older generation, because that's no excuse not to learn. So we can learn to do better. And so that would just be my suggestion.
I'll just jump off Carol's point really quickly and say that is definitely a trauma-informed principle to be able to have a warm handoff and to know where you're sending somebody. And if you're listening here and you're like, maybe my nonprofit doesn't really have a lot of these resources, and I don't really know if the org I've heard is good, maybe give them a call and just get to know each other. I mean, now's the time to really invest in other people doing this work. So I would encourage you all to do that.
I think to kind of build off of Lindsey's point too, when folks want to ask about resources, if you are a cis person and you have a trans friend, like, you be the person that on their website and on their Instagram that go through, that highlight stories of individuals that are queer, that have had abortions, and just what it felt like, what the experience was like, if they had certain pieces. So there are definitely resources out there. It's important to engage with them and to reshare those resources too. Because I'm also a firm believer that sometimes, like, we don't always have to be the person to, like, go on Canva and make the graphic. There are people who have the language and the experiences that are really kind of capturing all of that. So what would it say to actually uplift and kind of amplify that work instead of trying to kind of have little parts where our ego could steer the conversation?
Thank you all for that. And the chat is just booming with resources, and folks are sharing so much. So please seriously keep that up, because once again, we really want this to be a very action-oriented piece. So I'm going to pass it to Meredith, because now we're going to talk a little bit about contraception. So Meredith?
Yeah, so now we are hoping to focus a little bit more on the explicitly medical dimensions of this issue. So first, I would love if anyone could answer this, though Kirby, I think your legal expertise might be especially helpful here. What are the implications of this ruling for contraception access and abortion pill access?
Sure. So when people refer to abortion pills, they are probably referring to medication abortion. Which is a regimen of pills, 2 pills that you take that cause an abortion, just like an in-clinic abortion, also called a surgical or procedural abortion. So when we talk about banning abortion, that includes medication abortion or abortion by pills. So I think it's really important to be clear that that is the category of abortion. That is what this decision addressed. So this decision said there is no right to abortion in our Constitution, and it allows states to ban abortion. So that includes medication abortion. The decision does not mention and has no impact on contraception. Karen mentioned Justice Thomas, and he would love to now go after contraception, but at this point, contraception, including Plan B or other forms of emergency contraception, they are not at all impacted by this decision. So I think that's a really important distinction to make. But I'll stop there, and I can explain more about medication abortion, but I'll also, folks who are medical providers they might have more expertise than I do.
Oftentimes we have conversations with patients. We as healthcare providers have to keep it purely scientific. I try not to get into religious and or philosophical discussions about when pregnancy begins. I can just inform them about medications that are available and what we know as to how these medications work. A lot of states that I've been to or heard from nurses from, even though this Supreme Court decision has just happened, do have laws that require healthcare facilities to offer emergency contraception to patients following a rape or a sexual assault. And these are pills, and they're given in a one-time dose, and hopefully in the emergency department, where the patient is not sent out to a pharmacy to try to either buy over the counter or fill a prescription. They have very minimal side effects. They do not harm an existing pregnancy. So even though we would do a pregnancy test prior to the administration of these medications, in case someone is pregnant early on and even too early to show up in a pregnancy test, this medication would not harm that pregnancy. And so while there's so much controversy and so much discussion about abortion, this is a medically acceptable and safe way to prevent a pregnancy from even occurring in the first place. And so we encourage women, if they are concerned about getting pregnant based on either a consensual or a non-consensual act, to get a hold of emergency contraception as soon as possible, preferably within 3 days, but as late as up to 5 days following that contact, be it consensual or not.
I think this conversation also really shines the light on why when you're involved with one aspect, you could be involved with other aspects of a movement. And comprehensive sexual education faces so much scrutiny, but for certain political reasons. But when we don't have this education and we're fighting against it, we continue to see people conflate what it means to have access to abortion and contraception. A book that is dated that I love, it's very dated now and it's very binary, but really changed my life, was a book called How the Pro-Choice Movement Saved America. And I just loved reading that book as a younger person, because it really kind of tracked if there were individuals who were just anti-abortion or anti-choice, you would think that they would invest in comprehensive sex education, but they are actually anti-comprehensive sex education as well. They fund the same policies to formal only into abstinence-only sex education instead of comprehensive, and they view this fight again as a very holistic anti-bodily autonomy, anti-pleasure fight as well. And so it's really thinking about, I'm even thinking there's an episode of Black Mirror in popular media where someone, sorry to spoil, it's been out for years though, where it's someone just on screen confused an abortion pill with a contraception. And for anyone that doesn't, uses their political education to be through Netflix or TV, like that was a missed opportunity to correct certain pieces. So we already see in media how folks conflate those. And so when you're divesting from comprehensive sex education, this is a way where we have harmful like legislative effects because of that confusion.
I'll just jump in a little bit on this conversation, and I'm kind of gonna ask Carrol this question too. Back when I was in rural New Jersey, we were working with establishing more sites for post-sexual assault care, and we ran into an issue where some private Catholic hospitals did not want to provide that care because they did not want to provide emergency contraception. I'm wondering if my old colleague is here. I was looking for your name, Sam, and participants, but it's a problem that already exists in terms of access. Now in rural New Jersey, there was only a limited number of hospitals where we were working that were able to provide this care, some public and some private. And there was a lot of conversations with private hospitals about providing the emergency contraception. I'm not sure if Carrol wants to jump in as well.
Well, it's difficult when you work in a facility that won't even let you discuss it. I can speak for New York facilities. Since 2003, there's been a law on the books that if a patient requests emergency contraception, they not only have to be given information, but it has to be provided on site. And if you as a provider, because of your own personal religious beliefs, cannot have that conversation, you are responsible to find someone else who can. So I think those of us who live around facilities where it is not allowed to be discussed, where even if the provider working that facility wanted to, but they could not because of that facility's rules, then our community-based organizations have to make sure that we make available other options. And if an advocate is involved in those hospitals, then that advocate is a pipeline right to what's available in the community. As healthcare providers, I firmly believe that when you provide options to your patients, whether it be for safe discharge or for reproductive health or any other kind of medical options, it needs to be based on what the patient requests and what is going to promote the health of the patient, not what you personally believe. And so, I feel for those who work in those facilities, but you have to think of another way to get that information to your patients.
Absolutely. Thank you all for diving into this and for clarifying how some of these pieces sort of fit together. And following up on this line of questioning, and this is a question for anyone, but how can people in abortion-restricted states continue to access either medication abortion or contraception despite current and upcoming barriers they might face?
I can start if you want with just like the legal landscape of things. Okay, so things are changing very rapidly around the country in terms of access. So many states, some people have mentioned trigger laws. Many states had trigger laws, which essentially meant as soon as Roe was overturned in part or in whole, an abortion ban would go into effect. And so my former colleagues are now litigating all over the country to try to get those bans unblocked and get access restored. But in some places, as you said, abortion is now not accessible. So folks can obviously travel out of state, but that requires money. It requires childcare. If you have children, about 60% of abortion patients are already parents. You have to be able to leave your life for a few days to go out of state and get care that should be available to you at home. So for abortion pills, it's a little tricky because there is some legal risk associated with it. Many states have laws that do not allow a physician to prescribe the pills in state. There are opportunities for folks to self-manage abortion, which means you take abortion pills outside of the care of a physician. And medication abortion is incredibly safe, just like procedural abortion. So medically, there are very few risks to this. Legally, there may be some risk to this. So there is a wonderful organization called If When How that has a hotline that helps people who are self-managing their abortions and kind of answers questions, helps them with resources. So that's a really wonderful resource because I think, as someone mentioned in the chat, there are places that do allow medication abortion. They're out of the country, and so they're kind of out of prosecution. It's a little it's a little tricky. But yeah, I think people should know that medically, very, very safe. Legally, there's some risks. So you just want to be thoughtful and make sure you're talking to people and accessing resources like with If, When, How that can give you good advice. And I'll stop there and let other folks talk about other aspects of that.
Does anyone else want to jump in here? All right. Well, with that, thank you for adding that to the conversation. I think understanding that is really crucial here, and I'll pass it back to Sam.
Thanks so much, Meredith. We're almost done with our pre-prepared questions and getting ready for our audience questions. So please, again, put any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to be in this event until 6:30. I promise we will end on time. I just wanted to give some folks that reminder. We have a few more questions, and these are very action-oriented questions that we have for y'all. So we're going to talk about understanding this new reality. I'm not ready personally to say post-Roe yet. It doesn't feel real, but we're in this new reality, right? And so what can we do? So the first question we have for you all is, how do you think audience members can stay updated on abortion policies where they live? We're seeing unbelievable amounts of misinformation and fear mongering. So does anyone have any thoughts about good resources and good organizations that are tracking some of these pieces?
Kirby mentioned earlier that every state have a local abortion fund, and I think those are always the best places to go because they have they are trying their hardest to combat the misinformation and share the very specific pieces, especially about the difference between or if there's any type of local elections that are coming up that are really important. And so I think a lot of them may have a policy corner or a part of their newsletter, but I think with those local abortion funds is the biggest area. I have a lot of thoughts about some other pieces, so I'm trying to hold my excitement for those other parts. But I think with your local abortion fund, local is just always better because unfortunately we do have a part where sometimes folks are sharing clickbait. We're not immune to clickbait that what happens in this community. I even think for myself being in Kansas, being from Kansas, there's a local election, election around August 2nd that folks are mobilizing around. So folks, over-investing in sometimes some of the national piece, they're ignoring the fact that Kansans can kind of vote to codify abortion access on August 2nd if they want to. So just kind of really focusing on those local pieces, I think, is the best. And your local abortion fund is, we can always put you on to other places that they trust for their information, but I think they're the most appropriate first step.
I totally agree. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Carrol.
I was going to say, I agree with Tracia. It's amazing how much power we have that we don't know that we have. And don't be afraid to send an email or pick up that phone and call your local politicians, even your state politicians, even your national politicians. Most of the time when you call the national politician's office, you're going to get one of their aides or one of their staff members. And I'll be honest with you, that's who you really want to talk to, because they are the ones that are doing the research and are culling the information and getting that information to your legislators. So send that email, write that letter, pick up the phone, make that phone call. If there is what do they call it? The public forums where you can go down and address your legislators in person. Don't be afraid to do that. I mean, we have so much more opportunity and access to get out there and to know what's going on than women did back in the 60s and 70s when they really fought the fight. And so there's no excuse we cannot turn this around, but we have to start, and everybody has to get involved, because I don't want to say post-Roe either. And I'm a little bit upset that this might be the new reality, but I'm hopeful we can reverse this decision. I really am.
I was just going to jump in and agree. Abortion funds are great. Follow them on Twitter, follow them on Instagram. They're just really fun posts. They're energetic. They are super active. A few other favorites of mine, Rewire News. Imani Gandhi is super active on Twitter, and Rewire News just does incredible pro-abortion kind of content. They're really active. I really love Physicians for Reproductive Health. Jamila Parrott is the head of that organization. They do great work. I think they're really interesting to follow. And then someone earlier mentioned We Testify, which is a great organization. And the head of their organization, Renee, is also really, really active on Twitter. So there's so many, like, this community is so incredible and really engaged and really active. So as soon as you jump in, you'll get very deep into it. And there are just like so many good resources and good information out there.
Thanks so much, everybody. And that's like what we were hoping for with this panel, for folks who are like, what do I do? Like, I don't know where to go. I'm looking for places to go. And we're so excited that y'all are sharing all of these resources of folks who have been doing repro work for so long. And so it's just unbelievably helpful. And I hope folks in the audience are taking note of some of this and feeling a little less helpless. We have a couple more questions, and one is understanding our opposition in this fight. Understanding who and what we are up against. And so our question for folks is, who are the people, if you're comfortable naming names, groups or organizations that are against abortion access, and really how are they resourced? I know that there might be some tangible ways that we can divest from some of these groups to prevent them from gaining any more fiscal or political power. And so we just want to hear some of your thoughts about, you know, who is the opposition and what can we do about it?
I can jump in. I cannot wait to answer this question because I spent all semester doing some work around this, but I'm putting 2 links into the chat because one of our biggest, most not kind of silent opponents are crisis pregnancy centers, and the way that these religious nonprofits, non-medical clinics who do not have to report to HIPAA because they're not HIPAA compliant are being pivoted as a solution to a post-Roe world. I mean, the far right has been using CPCs, one, to track pregnancy and report that to the state, to track anyone that walks into these centers. They actively kind of usually view it as part of their religious duty to dissuade clients or patients from receiving an abortion. So I'll pay your rent, I'll give you, diapers, I'll give you, all these different pieces so you don't get that abortion. And then you have a child and you didn't have the support system or the resources, and now you have this person. But CPCs are so dangerous because they are both private and state funded. I think in 2017, Pennsylvania had actually redirected funds from TANF to go towards CPCs. And so because there are such a massive lobbying arm, again, getting involved with local budget hearings and local pieces on there is so important because they're receiving state funds and claiming to kind of be positioned as these medical centers, but they're not. They're usually religious nonprofits. And I put 2 links in the chat because Repro Action, I love them, could toot their horn all day long, has a bad faith medicine campaign. And a lot of their work is to really amplify and support trackers of where are all the CPCs across the country, how do you avoid them? And CPCs are also to name or to credit for a lot of the mislanguage that we hear sometimes in abortion rhetoric, a late term abortion or certain pieces about, oh, it's too late, that comes from CPCs. And so they're very well financed, very well networked. And continue to have campaigns. I mean, their Heartland, I think, had a campaign specifically to target, they mentioned to target Black and Brown individuals and to dissuade that group specifically from getting abortions. The Alliance for Advocates also did a really great report called Designed to Deceive, all about CPCs, the level of deception that they use to get patients in their doors. I could just talk so much about these organizations because they are deeply, deeply harmful. A lot of them further enact racism. And again, they have very latent ties to white supremacist ideals. And I just think in a country where there was an insurrection a year ago that we can't, escape the larger forces that are happening here. And CPCs, again, there's just a lot of Radical Reports also, Teddy Wilson, who's a reporter for that group, or he kind of owns that group, he's done a lot of work about highlighting how CPCs are now getting increasing of funding and getting more attention. And so I encourage everyone to look into what CPCs in their local neighborhood, see what actions there are. Some folks have gone as far to like spray paint on the clinic. This is not a real clinic. There are CPCs that, like in Kansas, will set themselves right next to an abortion clinic and will call patients or be like, oh, actually your appointment has been canceled, or come this door and that door. And so they really are intentional about doing whatever grassroots strategy they can do to get folks away from abortion. So it's like highlighting those individuals, seeing them in your local community, and collaborating with efforts to defund them through your local budgets, through your state budgets, or everything. Is just such a very tangible and necessary action, because these groups are being positioned as our next resource when they're not.
Yeah, I can't co-sign that enough. CPCs are so gross, and like the ways they treat patients, the things they say to patients. Most of my clients who are abortion providers, they had a CPC next to them. The CPC would often choose a name that was almost identical to their name, and they would try to decorate their storefront so they looked like an abortion clinic. Like they're really deceptive. They would also lie. They offer free ultrasounds, and so they would lie to patients and tell them that they were beyond the legal limit and that they couldn't get an abortion, when actually like they were still very much able to get an abortion. And to say that they put themselves forward as healthcare providers is just like really insulting to healthcare providers. So totally agree with that. Two of the main organizations in the anti-abortion movement are Alliance Defending Freedom and Americans United for Life. I'm hesitant to like tell you to look at their websites because no one should look at their stuff. It's really gross. But they do, Americans United for Life lay out their priorities for the year, and you can see the language that they write. State legislatures just take it directly and put it into bills. So often what they write in their priorities for the year, you'll then see them in the next session. So if you want to see what they are focused on now, unfortunately we are in a post-Roe world, so I'm going to say that. I've been saying it for about a year since Texas. You know, if you want to see what's coming next, I think that's the best place to look, though wouldn't necessarily recommend it because, again, really gross.
I'll just pop in for a sec here. I don't have any specific orgs to name, but I want to pull it back a little bit more as well to think about the fact that the same people who are pushing anti-trans legislation that want to roll back minors' rights to make decisions about their body, including reproductive decisions, to give more parental control over their children, including giving consent for young children to get married, like, 15, 16 years old. For the people who are in the room who might be sexuality educators or who might be sexual violence preventionists, this is also the pushback against including conversations about consent, sexual reproductive health, gender identity, and so on in the classroom. So this is all part of that same wave. And we need to really identify our mutual struggles, like I've been saying, and many people have been saying here, to think that it's not just the abortion, it's also all these other things that are going on simultaneously. And maybe that sounds exhausting, but maybe it's nice that we can all be here together to think about these things.
Thank you, everybody. We're gonna end with our final question that's hopefully gonna take this really sad landscape that we just laid out here into a productive, hopeful way. So Meredith, go ahead with our last question before we get to our Q&A.
Yeah, so like Sam said, we wanted to end on sort of an empowering note that uplifts us to all keep going. So if anyone would like to share briefly, what gives you hope in this fight?
I'll go first. I think what gives me hope is that it is the right of every human being to live a life free of violence, to be who they really are, and to have control over their body, whether or not the state chooses to recognize that. In other words, I think that this should be a time where we embrace each other and start to think outside of the state resources. If we're going to face a future where whether or not things will be legal or permissible, how can we work outside of that framework to still provide care to one another and to find community with each other? People will participate in this in different ways, depending on how they feel and how comfortable they are in their safety and their privilege and their power. But I think that this was not inevitable, but this kind of situation is going to be fought again and again. The fight of rights and freedoms is ever going. Whenever we make progress, there's always the risk of it being rolled back. So how can we start building outside of those power and control frameworks of the state in order to directly support one another and build community that can last past these struggles? And if we obtain those rights on a legal basis again, so that's what makes me feel hopeful, having the space with people and kind of strategizing about these things.
I can go. So I think this whole conversation about the post-Roe world, I think really is important to keep in mind that for many people throughout our country, we have been in a post-Roe world for decades. You know, if you were a woman living in Mississippi, which I believe had either a 48 or a 72-hour delay, you know, you had to go have an unnecessary ultrasound, wait either 48 or 72 hours to decide if you really knew that you wanted to have an abortion, which is crazy, and then go back, have your abortion. There was only one clinic that you could go to. You know, so again, you had to pay for it. Since right after Roe became law, something went into effect called the Hyde Amendment, which meant that Medicare would not cover abortion. So basically we said you have a right to abortion, but you have no right to have your abortion funded. So if you are a poor person, then sorry, your right doesn't exist for you. And that has just been the case for people for a long time. So I think this is really a moment for us to ask for more than Roe, to go beyond what Roe gave us, and let's try to build something bigger. And I think, again, this comes back to reproductive justice, because you have to think, I think as Lindsey has been saying, you have to think about how all of these movements connect and what do we actually want this to look like. I think for a while in the repro movement, we've been kind of like begging for scraps, like, let's try to keep this alive. Let's try to do this. Let's like narrow what we can get. And I hope this is a moment where people can come together and think broader about what is possible. What does our dream look like? Not just what we want to settle for. And again, I think having that movement be led by reproductive justice advocates is really important, because they are the folks that know what's going on. And I think they have this vision of how we can achieve what we actually want, not just what we're going to settle for. So that gives me hope.
I'd love to kind of just add on to what Kirby has mentioned, because I think something that I'm wanting to give me hope and that would give me hope is to see large nonprofits in New York City, Washington, D.C., and LA not harbor funds or exploit what's happening to individuals in the South and Midwest for donations for their own organizations. So if you're receiving excess donations, to give those to someone, to give those to groups in the South and the Midwest, but to also take, as you know, Kirby mentioned, these areas have been fighting against trap laws and other restrictions far longer than like the culture shock of what folks are in more, you know, blue or purple spaces are feeling. So I'm hoping that repro advocates in large places can step up instead of capitalizing on the moment. I also hope about thinking bigger, that we can think about what it means to claim to fight for reproductive rights on indigenous land when this is not our land, and we should always be trying to restore what was taken. So I'm hoping that we can also use this as a moment to realize that the colonial project that is the United States is not working, and that we can also divest from that. And what does it mean to give reproductive justice not for the people here, but for the people who were here when this country came and was originally pillaged and exploited?
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for inviting us in on your hope, and I'll pass it back to Sam for the Q&A portion.
Karen, did you want to share anything about hope?
I was just sitting here, I was just so mesmerized by what everyone else was saying, but I'm hopeful because thinking back to the early 70s and late 60s, when I started to become aware of these issues, we are so much more interconnected now, and there is so much greater ability to connect with others. And if we could, like Lindsey said, get all of the victims of these different oppressions and isms together, there's so much strength in numbers. And some of our groups who have more representation can take on the battle of those groups who have less, and sort of bring everyone into the fold. So I'm hopeful that that will happen, because I see young people as much more inclusive for the most part, and understanding of people's differences and acceptance of differences than maybe they were 50 or 60 years ago. And so I'm hopeful that we can get together and fix this problem.
Thank you all so much for that. I wrote in my script something very silly. I was like, oh, what gives me hope is all of you. But now I actually mean it. And it wasn't just something that I pre-wrote down. Just thank you for sharing how you guys are able to keep doing this work and keep feeling like we are making progress even when awful things are happening around us. So just thank you so much. We have 7 whole minutes for Q&A, which obviously is enough time to eradicate all these problems that we've laid out. So we're gonna get to as many questions as we possibly can, but before we do that, in the chat, we're going to put a link to a survey, a feedback survey for any participants to fill out. So you can fill that out whenever you want. So Scarlett's going to put that in the chat. It will also be in the follow-up email that you'll get next week with all of the resources that have been mentioned today. So please feel free to multitask and do that survey. We want to hear from you. And in particular, we want to hear from you if you want this kind of event to become a series. If you want more space to talk about these events, that it's not just a one-off thing. So put all of that in that survey. So we have a few audience questions that I'd love to get to in the short amount of time. So I'm just going to direct it specifically to panelists. I think that might be the best way to make sure that we're answering things. So we have a question about CPCs. So Tracia, I'm going to direct this one towards you, and then anyone else can join in. So someone wrote, recently we had a CPC contact us being a rape crisis center, to ask about our services. How can you go into how they might try to attack rape crisis centers and our role in advocating for survivor options?
Okay, I have a lot of responses. I'd be willing to even maybe do like an offline conversation some more, but I think the biggest piece is a lot of folks have mobilized their legal teams at these places to try to use harassment as a way to kind of legally corner these individuals that are calling to do that, because they do call and try to get information and harass. They know it's annoying, so they're going to continue to try. But I think for something about what folks at rape crisis centers can do is strategically, one, become well acquainted with the tactics and the names and locations of their CPCs that are around, and to strategically coalition build with a trusted abortion provider, independent in their communities if available, to also have some type of referral program or a safe place or a way that someone can say, this is who our organization is. One of the members of our board, they painted a very beautiful mural outside of their abortion clinic so that they could say we're the place with the yellow daffodil or whatever. Just trying to do little things to dissuade from that going into the wrong building, but they're going to try to do what's effective. Kirby, I'm interested in knowing some of your thoughts about this too, and I can send more thoughts offline as well for the sake of time.
Yeah, I think those are all really good ideas. I think that, right, how much can you actually, so I think, again, I feel like I need more information and I don't want to take too much time, but yeah, I'm happy if you want to also connect with me, I'm happy to contribute more offline. I just see that we have 4 minutes.
Thank you, folks. And so I'm also going to put my email address in the chat. So if folks want to get connected with our lovely panelists, we can do it through me because we don't want to inundate their inboxes. I know they're busy folks. So I'll put my my email in the chat in a moment. Another question that we have with the 3 whole minutes that we have left can be a little bit about, we've gotten a lot of different questions of different iterations of this. Where can people put their money? Where do you recommend folks put their money in this? Be as honest as you want.
Abortion funds. As Tracia said, don't give to large organizations. I worked for one, they're doing great work. They don't need your money. Local small groups need your money. Right now, there are 2 Texas clinics that are in the process of having to move out of state because they can no longer provide in Texas. So Whole Woman's Health, which is an incredible provider, is moving to New Mexico. And then Dr. Alan Braid, who is my former client, who is the only person who provided an abortion in violation of SB 8. He wrote an article in the Washington Post last year about it. He is having to close his Texas and Oklahoma clinics. and also move out of state. So they both are doing GoFundMes right now. So those would be incredible people to give to, and like your money is going directly to supporting a new clinic that will provide care. So those are my quick plugs.
Any other thoughts about where to put money?
I'm always going to be an advocate. My brain is flailing. An advocate for Sister Song, a Black woman reproductive justice led organization. I'm always going to be plugging Urge, who is primarily, in red states in the Midwest to do that advocacy work. With our board, we do stigma busting work. But I mean, we're not going to capitalize on the moment, but we just do stigma busting work, and we fund groups outside of individuals in the U.S. and domestically that are fighting stigma specifically. So, we funded a hip hop album in the Philippines where you can't get an abortion, but you can talk about abortion in a creative way. So a group of women, produced an album to talk about that. So I think if there's a part of the work that really excites you, if there's sometimes I think every pro action that, they're doing a lot of protesting CPC. So finding that place that really charges your heart, that can be tied to, tangible actions in your community, would just be really, really, really important.
We end with action. Thank you all so much. All of our panelists, just absolutely amazing insight into this. Being realistic about the reality of the landscape and also providing hope is something really challenging to do. And all of you managed to do it so, so well. And we're so, once again, just unbelievably grateful for your time, your energy, and your continued work in this fight. So thank you all so, so much. And to our audience that stuck around for an hour and a half, we are grateful for you all as well. We will be sending that follow-up email with all of the information that we promised to share with you. And just thank you so much again for everyone involved in the planning, to our wonderful ASL interpreters, and everyone that joined today. We will take your feedback, and then we will be in touch if we'd like to host more events like this. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening and doing something restful. And once again, thank you so much.